Welcome. I'm Sarah Barth, and I have the privilege of serving as the Executive Director of Semper Virens Fund. Thank you for joining us for another in our Under the Redwoods webinar series, in which we explore the history, beauty, science, benefits, inspiration of redwood forests. It's impossible to talk about redwood forests and conservation without acknowledging that the redwood forests in the Santa Cruz Mountains are among the ancestral home of many indigenous people who cared for and stewarded these lands for millennia until they were forcibly removed. I am really grateful and pleased that Semper Virens is working today with some of their descendants, including the Amamutsin tribal band and the Muwekma Ohlone tribe, to help restore some of their cultural and traditional relationships to these amazing forests. And I suspect our guest speaker will speak a bit about that, or between the two of us, we will hear a little bit more about that today in our conversation. It's also really important for me to acknowledge that the vision Semper Virens Fund has for a thriving and healthy network of redwood forests is only possible because that vision is shared by people like you and the thousands of others who support our organization and allow us to achieve the conservation gains that we've made. So it makes me especially happy to share our work, share new insights and perspectives about redwoods with all of you. I know many of you are really familiar with the webinar format, but just two things to remind you. If you want to ask questions, please submit them using the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen, and we will try to address as many of them as we can. And secondly, if you missed some of this or you wish to share it with others, we will be recording it and posting this on our website afterwards. So we're going to be speaking today about California's magnificent state parks. As you know, many of you know, Semper Virens' history is indelibly intertwined with the state park system. And we were there for the very creation of the state park system, and we've been involved in the establishment and ongoing expansion and enhancement of many of our state parks. But before we dive into the topic of parks and introduce our speaker, just want to acknowledge another thing, which is a major milestone that was passed since we last had one of these webinars, and that is the inauguration of President Joe Biden. And as one of his very first acts, he had the United States rejoin the Paris Climate Accord. And for those of you who care about forests or in any way care about the future, I think that is a momentous occasion that we celebrate and is worth recognizing. And then more close to home, as many of you know, we had an incredibly apocalyptic fire season this year, wildfire season, and it extended up through just last week even. In fact, some of the fires may still be burning as we had wildfire flare-ups in the Santa Cruz Mountains, even in the area that had previously burned, just within the last few days. And as I sat down to begin this webinar, I was looking at the ominous storm clouds that we face because we're expecting some intense rain. And following that wildfire, we are thinking about and planning for the likely landslides that will follow. And so all of that is to say, we're at an incredibly dynamic time, a time of change, a time of urgency in our nation, in our region, in our climate, and in our forests. And in many ways, that dynamism, that urgency, that need for change and evolution and forward looking to find solutions is playing out in our state park system. And so it's one reason I'm especially delighted to have here today our guest, the newly appointed Director of California State Parks, Armando Quintero. He is going to be facing some really important challenges. We have a state park system that is the envy of, certainly of the nation, maybe of the world. And yet it's a state park system that has an enormous backlog of aging infrastructure, projects and repairs that are needed, inadequate funding to meet those needs. At the same time, we have a growing populace. We have a diverse populace that even though the park system is meant to serve, some of our citizens don't feel safe or welcome in these parks. We have climate change that is threatening parks in a way that, mimics what we've seen in the Santa Cruz Mountains. So he has his plate full with challenges, but I am certain that we have found the right man to meet the moment. And in my discussions with him, I think he shares the same vision that Semper Virens has for future of the state park system that is responsive to climate change, that creates a network of places that people can visit, that's inclusive and welcoming, that invites back in Indigenous people and Indigenous knowledge. I could go on and on, but instead I will let him go on and on. So with that, let me introduce you to new State Park Director, Armando Quintero. He brings a deep wealth of experience in public land management, in parks operations, and let me welcome him to our webinar. Director Quintero, welcome.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you so much. And really, it's a joy to be joining all of you this afternoon. Thanks for the honor. And being asked to step into this role really is still something that I almost have to remind myself of every few days. It doesn't seem real, but certainly the problems we're all facing are very real. So it's a pretty quick switch from remembering to getting pretty focused on what we're all facing. So it's really a pleasure to be here. And I think the world of the Semper Virens Fund, and as Sarah said, I actually am well versed in the role of the Semper Virens Club in really the creation of what is now the state park system and the founding and creation of Big Basin as the very first state park. So it's a pleasure to be here.
So we're going to do a Q&A format, and I have the privilege of getting to fire away some initial questions, and then we'll welcome some from the audience. So let me start with just big picture. I mentioned some of the challenges and opportunities that you face in this new role, and I'm really curious what your ambitions are for your tenure, and when you leave this role at some point and look back, what is it you want to have accomplished?
Well, I think the answer to that is framed by my very first hours in my role as State Parks Director. On my first day of work, I was actually sworn in Santa Cruz by Zoom. And then a few hours after that, I met with the governor and a whole team of people up at the headquarters of Big Basin, where the governor toured the headquarters. And that was led by state parks rangers and some CAL FIRE folks. It was really a pretty amazing morning. That was on September 1st. So Big Basin was still smoldering. They were just starting to take down hazard trees and such. And in fact, there was a pocket of flame still in the top of the mother of the forest. And as we were walking back after this tour, I happened to be speaking with the governor when he stopped, turned around and looked at this group of members of the media, senior leaders from state agencies and federal agencies, and he introduced me as the new State Parks Director and mentioned that I had just been sworn in hours before. And then without warning, he asked me to give the audience or give this, give the group there what my vision was for the California State Park system. It's not really something you can
pressure or
prepare
anything.
Yeah. But what happened is, I think it was a combination of having really I've been thinking a lot about state parks for weeks and just thinking of all the things that we're dealing with. So my answer in short was something like this. Here we stood in the original California State Park, which was actually brought about by the citizen activism of the Semper Virens Fund or Semper Virens Club. And so from the beginning, state parks have been in a partnership, in a double helix partnership with park partners like Semper Virens, Save the Redwoods Leagues, and others. That those numbers have grown. And what I said was that, we, for the last over 100 years, 160 years, if you include Yosemite as the first state reserve of public land, we had all, as park managers, been carrying forward these traditions that were literally 120 years old plus, or 140 years old plus. But now look at where we stand in this moment. And we're in the midst of climate change. We have the tremendous pressure of equity and access and environmental justice. We've got all the new science that we now are aware of. We've got these traditions that we carried forward where we did things like we built structures right in the very heart of these precious landscapes. And, now we're seeing, these catastrophes like this catastrophic wildfires and such. And then on top of that, with the pandemic of COVID, all of that together really has highlighted these public lands as what I think of as essential landscapes. These are places now where we all go, not only for physical well-being and health, but we're going there for mental health. And I also am well aware, especially with the incredible pressure that these public lands are getting, it's a place for social health too. These places are invaluable. And so now, what's the challenge? And I think it's this: how do we take all that into account and move for the next 100 years in a way that creates traditions and literally experiences and thinking and actions that really take us into the next century in a very healthy and in a trajectory where we've learned from our experiences. And so that's where we stand. And I'm extraordinarily excited to be able to work with partners like Semper Virens and all of the other park partners. The amount of partnership that exists in California for public lands is really quite stunning. And I know we'll be talking more about this as we converse this afternoon, Sarah, but I wanted to say that I really feel like the work that is in front of us demands really the best of the collective wisdom that we can garner. And there are efforts underway already with Big Basin, which I think actually set a template for how, and I don't want to say I want to say the way we are thinking, and by we, I mean the royal we, that's you, park professionals and others, stakeholders that are coming together to figure out how do we think of these places going forward. So I'm excited about the momentum. And I think as we talk, I'll be able to mention some of the things that I hope to see get put in place in the next couple of years. And I also am looking forward to setting trajectories that are really going to be long-lived, but it's going to be really dependent on healthy partnerships.
Well, we're ready.
Okay.
As you know. Well, speaking of partnerships and things that partners can do for parks, one of them is buying wildlands that are appropriate for expansion of or creation of new parks. And Semper Virens Fund, for example, currently owns thousands of acres of forest land that we would love to see added to existing parks like Butano and Big Basin, and that were purchased actually for that purpose. But the state park system, because of lack of funding and a variety of other reasons, has really slowed down its growth and expansion of the existing system. And yet at the same time, we have a burgeoning population and we have growing demand for parks, as I think we've seen during COVID. People have just used them more than ever as a place of solace and respite and recreation. And so I'm curious what you think the future looks like for adding more protected lands or historic units to the system. How can partners like Semper Virens help you in that regard, help the state park system in that regard?
Well, there's an absolute focus from the governor's office through down to parks, through the Natural Resources Agency and parks, that we're very interested in increasing acquisitions or new properties. There have been a number of acquisitions that have been approved for state parks since the early 2000s. And while there was funding to purchase properties, it did not include the funding to pay for the operations and the expanded sort of staffing needs. And by that, I don't just mean people who can work in the parks, but we need the resources managers, both cultural and natural, and all of those. So we've been constrained basically since about 2010 in really being able to add new lands to state parks. But I can tell you that the governor's current budget actually includes $6.3 million to expand state parks, as well as a one-time match of $6.3 million to leverage the increase of lands for the state park system. And we have been working for some time to identify the high priority in holdings, such as the properties that that you with Semper Virens Fund have been acquiring that we can then move into the system. And so we're working on a list that's a prioritized list. And, many of the strategic holdings that you've put in place really fit our priorities for acquisitions. As an example, there's a number of parcels around the Castle Rock area that would provide perfect opportunities for public access. And actually, the beauty in many ways in terms of the work that you all have done is that really it allows us to do those acquisitions without increasing operational costs. I haven't been there in person yet, but I've looked at photographs and read all about the Kirkwood entrance property, and really is it's a beautiful example of some of the kinds of things that we're looking at. But we also are looking at new areas that may not be on anybody's radar. And of course, this is also an effort to be thinking about how we can align with the governor's 30 by 30. So 30% of California preserved in public lands by the year 2030. And that's another part of, there's a number of initiatives in the governor's office that we are focused on around climate, biodiversity and habitat, access and equity. There's a number of things that we are looking at, so that when we look at these acquisitions, we want to think about how does that really match that. And I'll actually mention one thing that was a surprise to me when I came into this role, and that was that I was not aware of the significant grants program that State Parks manages for the state of California. There's actually 3 groups of grants. State Parks has one large group of grants that are funded by different bond issues and propositions, and the Land and Water Conservation Fund. The Off-Highway Vehicle Program has a large grant program, which is funded by gas taxes and license fees. And then the Boating and Waterways Program also has a grants fund. And the combination of those grant programs, actually since the year 2000, has actually allowed for or funded the investment of over $3 billion of public programs and access acquisitions throughout the state. And these are not within state parks, they're in communities. These grants have paid for things like nature centers, the establishment of trails, the development of education programs at places like zoos and other areas. This year, I'm been working to really promote that grants program to make sure that what we're doing is, as we help fund services for communities in their communities that are park related, that what we're doing along with those efforts is we're connecting those communities to what these places are relative to the parks that they can go visit. So the marketing opportunity, and by marketing, I don't mean selling. By marketing, I mean letting folks know that they too are owners of these absolutely stunning land and waterscapes that we have in the state. And obviously with what we've been going through in the last year, again, I really see that these places have tremendous value for both our physical, mental, or I should say 3 things: physical, mental, and social health. So I'm particularly excited about what we're going to be able to do with our formal acquisition programs, as well as established granting programs. And this year, by the way, we are going to be making decisions on $400 million worth of investments in communities around California, and you'll be hearing about that.
Which is so exciting, and I'm really glad that you mentioned that program, because I do think it's too little known. And I think what I'm hearing you say, so tell me if I'm extrapolating too far, but I think I've heard you say a version of this in other settings, which is that the future of state parks may involve providing services on lands that are park-like and park-esque resources, but they may not be necessarily owned or run by state parks themselves. And I think park partners, or at least speaking for Semper Virens, I think that's fine and smart and strategic. And I'm wondering, I want to bring you to talk very specifically about Big Basin, both because I expect this audience is curious and is going to want to hear a little bit from you about just where things stand with Big Basin post-fire, but also because, building off this example of the grants program, are there ways that we can look at the future of Big Basin that involves reaching out to or utilizing new models, new ways of having a state park exist and meet the needs of the people, the community, the ecology, that may be very different from what Big Basin and a classic state park looks like now. So could you tell us a little
Sure.
bit about sort of what's actually happening at Big Basin? Where do you see it going? But also this broader question of how is Big Basin potentially a model of what state parks and state park partnerships might look like going forward?
Thank you for that question, Sarah. Well, as you know, or as you may or may not know, the initial recovery phase is underway. And what that has meant is things like hazard tree removal, culvert replacement, and making assessments around the facilities. We are doing a fair amount of work already and working on removing burn debris and such. And really, all of these things are actually related to safety issues. Just that hazard tree removal that we have to do within Big Basin is going to cost in the neighborhood of $7 million. We've also been, and today with the arrival of these atmospheric river, this atmospheric river, the team in Big Basin has been working with a couple of different agencies to prepare for what we expected might be heavy winter rains. So fingers crossed that we don't have too much damage from things like debris flows and floods. But as you know, these catastrophic fires can really damage the health of the soil, and it sort of removes the soils of really being able to act like sponges. And sometimes in cases where they're extremely hot fires, you really get some pretty severe runoff. So we're extremely concerned about that. But what I wanted to get more to what your question is, Sarah, one of the things that I said with our parks leadership team and with the folks from Big Basin, and we have a number of partners who are coming in along with Semper Virens, but we also have, the founder and owner of Esri, Jack Dangerman, wants to be at the table with us as we put our plans together for the future, and by ours, I mean our collective plans together for what Big Basin can look like in the future. What I asked the team to do, and they've already done the first phase of this, is I asked the park leaders and managers to actually set the table for how we can move through an effective planning process for Big Basin, and taking into account everything that I said on my first answer. How do we make sure that we're doing climate change planning? How do we apply science and know that the work that we're doing actually fits within the environment of Big Basin? And are we doing the right things in the right places? What are the roads and trail systems going to look like? And that team has already put the first phase of that project together. And the next phase is going to be to bring in all the stakeholders like yourselves to help us really realize the vision for what Big Basin can look like in the next century. And I'll give you some of the ideas of things that have come up. Do we really want to put the infrastructure, including wastewater treatment and things like that, in the heart of this redwood forest? Probably not. So we're going to be asking some big questions about how do we envision a park that actually can be a sustainably built infrastructure within this precious landscape for the next century, so we can all experience these places for sort of the majesty that they represent, and for the natural processes that we have to continue to manage within these landscapes. In part, these catastrophic fires have occurred not just because of increased temperatures, but because, as you know, over the last century, we've eliminated wildfires, and really fires that we now know to have been a really healthy process. So one of the ways that I see Big Basin happen, the planning for Big Basin happening, is as we reimagine the park for all these conditions, I'm excited that what we may end up coming away with is a template that has us that creates a template that when we go to work on other state park projects, we can hold that over these projects and go, are we asking all the right questions for the future and for sustainability? And one of the things that we want to make sure that we do in that process is make sure that we engage all of the communities, the Native American groups from the region, like the Amamutsin, and the groups that you're working with there in Santa Cruz. So really, I see it as an opportunity to build a template for how we look at parks across the system. And I can tell you that we're about to enter a very robust planning process with you, with the community, and with stakeholders. And I'm very excited about that. And I'm going to mention just one more thing. When you said, Sarah, about making investments in local communities, a really quick story is I used to work at UC Merced, and adjacent to UC Merced, there's about 16,000 acres of really rare vernal pool land. There's very rare vernal pool landscape there. Once a year, there's a weekend where folks get together, who are mostly scientists and researchers, in a large chunk of private land. And it's really a spectacular privilege to spend the night in this middle of the Central Valley in a wilderness. And I invited a colleague along with the dean of our School of Natural Sciences at UC Merced to join the group for this one weekend. And the colleague that I invited was a young woman who was born and raised in Merced, got her degree in literature from Berkeley, and she now raises money for the vernal pool complex in the campus. The second morning that we woke up, that we all woke up out in the middle of this vernal pool complex, I was talking with the dean of School of Natural Sciences, and Hannah, this young woman who's in her mid-20s, came walking towards us from her tent as she was sort of waking up, and she brushed her hair away from her face, and it looked like she was crying. And I said, Hannah, are you okay? She was born and raised in Merced, which is 25 minutes from where we were camping, and she was crying. And she looked at us and and she said, Armando, she goes, I didn't know that I lived here. And I think that as a community, as a statewide community, we may have the opportunity to engage people with the pretty much the magic that you can find anywhere in California, close to their homes. And what we can do together is make the connections between those experiences and the other lands all over California, which are so spectacular. There you go.
So that story that you just told, we have versions of that we experience, staff at Semper Virens Fund. The examples I can give of kids who come to Castle Rock State Park for the first time through programs that we've helped fund that are run by Friends of Santa Cruz State Parks. The stories of those kids being in a state park like Castle Rock or Big Basin or any of them for the first time. They live 25 minutes away in downtown San Jose, and didn't know that it was available to them or that it was their state park. I think those are really powerful experiences for those kids. We see them come back then with their families, often bringing their families to those parks for the first time. And it's something that as we designed the new entrance at Castle Rock, we thought a lot about, but I'm curious how you are thinking about it as we look at whether it's the future of Big Basin or the future of the park system writ large. What are ways that we can help make these parks more welcoming, more inclusive, even just put them on the radar screen of families that may not know that this backyard park exists? And how are you thinking about it? And are there ways that partners like Semper Virens can assist?
Sure. There's a whole list of things that we're talking about relative to creating better access. One of them is things like low cost accommodations. I don't know how many of you have seen the small cabins that are appearing in state parks, and you can rent them for the night for $100. And they're basically a cabin that right now, most of them have 4 bed platforms in them, and they've got a bathroom nearby, and there's usually a group of cabins that are together. They're really nice, and you don't have to buy a bunch of camping gear to use them. You just need a sleeping bag and a pad, and they're pretty accessible for everyone. We're looking at greatly expanding the low cost accommodations. We have park partners like Parks California and the State Parks Foundation and others who are very interested in funding school programs where we can get buses in when we can travel again, bringing kids and families to parks, especially in the regions where they live. Because just as you mentioned, Sarah, you've got kids who are 25 minutes away from these magnificent redwood forests, but yet they didn't even know they were there, nor have they been there before. I'm also looking at, there's a number of groups that work in the out of doors and work with these communities where there may be cultural barriers. And I'll mention one of them is Latino Outdoors. Um, and um, and there's another group that works Afro Outdoors, which is pretty amazing. Actually, I just said the wrong name for that group, but there's a number of groups that are bringing kids from disadvantaged communities to parks and public lands. And I think that we're going to be looking at ways of expanding that access, which also includes things like seeing how we can reduce costs or make for access. I know that there are park programs that I'm familiar with where, for example, the park agencies make park passes available in libraries where kids can check out a park pass for their family. I don't know that, I want to explore everything that we can that makes sense, that we also can sustain from a financial standpoint, but that also alleviates the financial burden on families and really makes these places truly accessible. And a part of that will also be working on the continuing representation of park staff that represents the communities that we serve. And I've worked in that world with national parks. It's a fairly, it's a very achievable effort that can really bring a lot of talent and strength to the parks agencies.
So you just covered a lot of different things, but I think I'll hone in on one particular piece, which is the low cost accommodations. Semper Virens Fund, in partnership with our close allies, Peninsula Open Space Trust, was responsible for buying, enhancing, and then ultimately transferring to state parks Little Basin, which is a very well-known family camping set of cabins. My kids were in tears and still cry when they know they can't go back there because it burned to the ground in the fires this fall. And so my question for you is, as we think about things like low cost accommodations or any kind of visitor facilities, whether it's campgrounds or a visitor center that are expensive, that require, a decade or more to get built. At the same time, we're thinking about areas burning and reburning. And I'm curious if you have any thoughts or insights into how we balance this need for infrastructure and facilities to make parks accessible and welcoming and family friendly. At the same time, we recognize that some of these places are going to burn repeatedly. And so how is Parks thinking about wildfire, whether it's in the context of the infrastructure or just in general?
Sure.
Can you talk a little bit more about that?
And well, you brought up a bunch of stuff too just now with that question. And I'll mention that no, the budget for the Natural Resources Agency relative to forest management is significant right now in the proposal. And just for state parks, we're looking at an $85 million general fund increase, a one-time increase to really step up the pace and scale of forest management at state parks specifically. We are also working with the Deputy Secretary for watersheds. Her name is Jessica Morse. This is her focus, and she actually has put in for a significant, I think it's a $5 billion budget for investing in watersheds and forest management around the state. What we're all talking about right now is not going year to year when it comes to forest management investments, but putting together a decadal plan. So 10 years, what can we do in 10 years? And of course, when you start looking at forest management, it's forest thinning, it's reestablishing on a regular basis controlled burns, and all of that needs to be done in in consideration of everything, like where do we have visitor facilities? How do we manage those areas? And there actually is as a state, between national land managers and state managers, there's a significant amount of experience in how you can do that. And I think that I'm hoping that with the catastrophes that we all saw happen in California this year or this last year with wildfires, that there could be more public support for us to actually go in and do the sort of forest management that has to be done. And I also think that it will be most effectively done if we are able to get departments and agencies to work together. So for example, in Lake Tahoe, State Parks is actually working in partnership with CAL FIRE and the Air Quality Resources Control Board. So the three departments work together to do the fire planning. And so there isn't a big bureaucratic series of steps you have to take. It's a team that goes in, and they've been very effective in doing really good forest management. And also at Big Basin, one of the things that you'll be seeing as we illuminate what happened during the fire there is there had been, State Parks has been doing control burns in certain parts of Big Basin, and it looked like it made a big difference. So not only is this about reducing catastrophic wildfire, but it's also, the strategy is also one of looking at what's called the urban wildland interface. So where do these parks, public lands align with, get right into the next door areas of neighborhoods. And so that too offers an opportunity for partnerships on how we move ahead to create healthier forests and healthier communities.
Yeah, which of course are intertwined,
Yeah.
right? The fate of those forests and the fate of those communities are
Yeah.
intertwined. And I'm so glad to hear you're thinking about it at the landscape scale. I know in talking to some of your staff about Big Basin that they are really thinking with a very innovative and open mindset about the park as part of a larger landscape. I do think that's where the future lies.
Absolutely.
So let's talk a little bit about one of the limiting factors that has, as I've observed parks over the last, say, decade, that's been a challenge is just lack of financial resources, which in turn sometimes has translated into lack of staff resources. And I am curious how you're thinking about growing those resources. We were delighted to see the governor's budget include what looked like to us a large bump in investment, and we're grateful, very grateful for that. But I'm wondering how we can, and how folks on this webinar, how your partners, our supporters, can help champion with political leaders the need to invest in parks. Semper Virens Fund and many of our partners were deeply involved in the passage of Proposition 68, but it can't just be bond measures that fund parks. And so I'm just wondering how you're thinking about the financial question and how we can help as partners build political support that in turn supports you in accomplishing some of these ambitious goals that you're talking about.
Sure. Thank you for that question. And I was so glad that you mentioned landscape scale at the beginning of your question. I actually have been involved in creating some landscape scale network agreements. And I think that the way that we all need to think about how we protect these lands and the landscapes around them is, I think we really need to consider them as putting together a portfolio of landowners and land managers, and you may see alignments that may not be apparent at the beginning, but I'll give you an example. There were folks who put out grants and other programs aside from, well, let me back up. I'm really interested in seeing how we can strengthen the full portfolio of funding. And by that, I mean ongoing funding, which is going to require work with the legislature, showing the value of what these places are to the public, and not just in terms of recreation, not just in terms of mental health and social health, but also, these landscapes really contribute to water quality, air quality, water quantity, and they're natural. These natural systems and the biodiversity and the health of the biodiversity of these systems is critical to the regional health of the areas where we live. And by that, I mean literally the air, water we breathe, and all the creatures involved in all of that. And so we really do need investments that come from all quarters. And I'll just give you a quick example in terms of landscape scale and mention a few other things. In a project that I was involved with where I live in Marin County, we put together a memorandum of understanding between national parks, state parks, county parks, and the water district, which owned a large part of the watershed on Mount Tam. And so what happened, just as one example, is rather than the 4 agencies going out after grants for projects individually, where one agency might only have 20,000 acres of land where they could implement those efforts. What this agreement did is it allows that group now to apply for grants, and it's based on the whole mountain. Yeah. And almost immediately upon getting this agreement in place, we were effective in competing for significantly larger grants for landscape scale changes and landscape scale investments. We shared science, messaging for all the visitors. So rather than having this a place where there are borders between land managers, it sort of has become a place where the message for the whole place is the same. I mean, there's a tremendous opportunity there. And I also think that we have sort of participants in a portfolio for land protection that can include groups, of which there are several that have appeared, who literally take private investment funds and are able to figure out the value of the ecosystem services that come out of the system. Some of these groups, there's one group, for example, called Blue Forest, and that's a little bit different, but Blue Forest works in the Sierra Nevada. There's another group that's called Ecosystem Partners. And Ecosystem Partners, for example, has been able to raise billions of dollars in private capital to help fund the creation and the restoration of healthy systems for the downstream benefits. It actually protects the areas for the downstream and benefits that come out of those areas. So I think efforts like that, combined with really educating the legislature about the value of what we're doing. And also, I think that with the grants program that we have, and I'll finish with this, I'm very interested in making sure that all of the members of the legislature understand that through state parks, millions of dollars, sometimes $40–50 million, $50 million are being spent in their districts for public access and really public benefit having to do with outdoor recreation. And I really hope that what we can do is create a web of understanding, if you will, about the value of these places, not only from where they are, but for where we all live.
Yeah, I feel like our parks, state and federal, are mom and apple pie issues, and we should have park champions in every district in the state legislature, bipartisan. And unfortunately, we don't have that now. And I think it's incumbent upon organizations like Semper Virens Fund to help change that. So I'm glad that you're thinking about it as well.
And we have John Laird where you are, which is he's an amazing partner. We're so fortunate.
Yes. For those of you who don't know, he's our newly elected senator, but also has a long history, including serving as the state secretary of natural resources. And he like you in some ways, really is, I think, a visionary with regard to natural resource management. So we have, as I said earlier, some right people in the right place at the right time, I think, to really catalyze change. So I'm going to ask you one last question, and then I'm going to cede the floor to our guests to see what questions they may have posed for us, or for you, really. The last question is going back to what I started with, which is I talked about the fact that the region in which we work, and this is true of most of California and probably the entire country, was once inhabited by indigenous people and who actively managed this landscape, stewarded it, including with active prescribed burning that they've been trying to get others to pay attention to and implement. And I think people are listening now, but I just wondered if you could say a little more about state parks' relationship, either in our region or beyond, with indigenous tribes, and how what you see happening with that going forward.
Well, I think that there's some big opportunities, and also there's some very important signals that we can together create for society writ large, and also for all of the Native American tribes and regional groups, and the folks who are descendants of the ancestors, the original people here. So I'll give you a couple pieces. One of them is I've had this sort of, I've imagined that how incredible it would be if in a few years, when any of us go to any state park, along with seeing the welcome sign that has the name of the state park, you also see a sign that says, these are the ancestral lands of,
Yeah.
and then it mentions the people. And, with, the history of humans in California, different groups have inhabited the same land over time. And so there are some areas where it's going to be very clear that, we've got, this is the name of the ancestral group here. And there are others where we're going to have to work with the regionally based groups to figure out that messaging. And I just think that creating that signal by itself, I think, extends our human history back in a really beautiful way. And I also think that what it does, I hope, is messages to all of us that we too are a part of that trajectory. We are now the folks that are here along with the descendants of those ancestors. So we look forward together, I hope. And that would be just incredible, I think, for me. But also seeing, the relationships as you have been engaged in with the Amamutsan group, with the Moekma Ohlone people. I mean, those are really, I think, models for regions throughout California. And I'm very interested in seeing how we can create memorandums of understanding, versions of co-management with tribal groups throughout California. And there's a tremendous amount of interest there. And a part of those sorts of agreements that can be a real mutual benefit, I think, is bringing forward the ancestral knowledge rather relative to land management, as well as really keeping those cultures alive, really helping to nurture those cultures so that they're sustained. I mean, there are still, I know that many people realize this, but certainly not all realize that there are still a number of indigenous languages that are spoken, in California. And of course, what I would love to see is more names, more place names that actually are connected to the ancestral people. And a lot of those names exist already. And I don't know what they are in your region, but where I live, there's Mount Tamalpais, and Tamalpais literally is a Miwok, Coast Miwok word that means hill by the bay. So things like that. And actually, I would love to see a more engaged presence of the native cultures in the parks so that people can actually experience the cultures and the worldview. And also not experience as a worldview from some ancient history, but connecting that ancient history with the present worldview. And I'll finish with this. A really good friend of mine was a cultural demonstrator in Yosemite, and he is Native American. His name is Furman. And one time after doing a traditional dance in the roundhouse at Yosemite, somebody came up to him and said, "Why are you wearing tennis shoes?" And Furman said, "They're comfortable." And I just thought that was just beautiful, because I don't want to see us package each other as some image from someplace else. We are all a part of living cultures, including the first people.
We're not a diorama like you'd see in the Natural History Museum. Yeah. Well, that's great. Okay, well, I could talk to you for a long time, but I'm going to
Thank you,
open the
Sarah.
floor. Thank you. I'm going to open the floor to our guests and let my colleague Matt Schaefer tell you some of the questions that he's been getting while you and I have been chatting.
Okay.
Thank you both for a very engaging discussion. We got a number of questions related to Big Basin and fire, and not surprisingly. And so I will attempt to summarize a couple of them, Director Quintero. I know you've talked a little bit about it, but there's some questions about the existing prescribed fire program that's been in place, and if there are plans to evaluate the fire behavior based on how the program functioned over time, as well as whether there's any plans to establish some permanent fire breaks in Big Basin or to have natural fire breaks that might prevent some of the rapid spread like we saw in last year's wildfire.
Great questions. Thank you for the questions. I mentioned Esri, the GIS guru of the world, really, and Mr. Dangerman has offered to bring the resources of Esri. We're already working with him on Big Basin, and part of what they're able to do is do just this amazing landscape mapping. That's actually going to be a part of the planning for how we're going to be looking to future management of those lands. It's going to help tell us which fires should be high priority and how we should continue to keep an eye on those. And I think that going forward, we're all going to be seeing forests that are a combination of mechanical thinning and removal of exotic species, and also control burns. And so that is something that we all will get to watch actually be put in place. And connected to that, I'm not sure how many of you have already seen, but it is just astonishing to me to already see so much new growth on these coast redwoods in Big Basin that just looked like towers of charcoal, and they're putting out new growth, and it's just, it's heartwarming. And I look at that and think about that almost as hopefully a model of resiliency for us. It's a real inspiration. So I hope I answered the two questions.
Yes, thank you. I appreciate that. We had another question, a follow-up on, you had mentioned very early on in the conversation about some of the larger initiatives that State Parks is participating in, including the 3030 initiative. And there was a question about wondering about more about how State Parks will be participating in that program.
Well, just this morning, I was on a 1.5-hour call with the Secretary of Resources and all the heads of the different resources agencies in California, and we are actually putting together a sea level rise and climate action plan for California. That is, we're looking at things, everything from, we know that restoring, for example, wetlands along the shoreline can actually help reduce the impact of sea level rise. In Louisiana, when the hurricanes hit, there was some massive wetland restoration programs that had taken place there. And the way those landscapes behaved in a hurricane there really prevented hundreds of millions of dollars of damage. And so there's a number of ways of looking at these landscapes as really being not only preserving California, but also preserving those areas that are going to help buffer any threats from things like sea level rise and climate change. And so that's a part of what we're doing when we look at the priority areas for preservation. It's like, and also we also know that we need to be looking at entire landscapes. So along with just doing these biopsies of preserving land, I really do think, again, as Sarah said, landscape scale thinking is absolutely what we have to do. We have to be applying systems thinking. I mean, I have this imaginary future where we can actually see a wild river from the crest of the Sierra all the way to the bay, and it actually looks like something you would see, I don't know, a local slice of Africa, if you will, really just a wild, healthy system that ends up being a model for us. And so I think that there's some really wonderful thinking, and I'm actually very anxious to see what kind of actions we can take, both human and physical actions, because the human stuff is oftentimes the hardest of creating healthy relationships for that level of cooperation. But looking forward to that.
I know this human and this set of humans at Semper Virens Fund will be happy to be a part of that. I think, well, just listening to you, I'm thinking that, the role of land trusts like Semper Virens and our many partners in part is to help you fill in some of those missing pieces, right, of the tapestry that maybe Parks doesn't own, or, isn't one of our US national forests, but that we can help build out the jigsaw puzzle of protected lands, protected streams, rivers, to get to watershed level protection, landscape scale protection.
And with what you say, Sarah, what it makes me think about is I think that there's a real opportunity for us to be working as regional entities, regional partners, in literally doing basically ecosystem service planning. There is a value there that actually demands regular investment by the beneficiaries. And I don't mean that to,
Yeah.
but we don't realize, so many of us don't realize. I mean, I'll give you a good example. Very few people in California know where their water comes from. And most of what many of us pay for water really is only for the gray infrastructure. It's for the pipes, the pumps, and the people and the energy.
Yeah.
And I'll also say that 20% of the energy used in California is just for moving water. So next time you turn on your faucet, realize that you're using electricity in one way or another. And you see what I'm saying? And so
Yeah.
when you really think about the healthy systems and accounting for everything that it takes, in fact, I think that as Californians, we all rely on these watersheds. I mean, that's what they are. We should all be investing in those watersheds as a part of our forest health strategies. But right now, what we have to do is demonstrate those values. And that's what we're doing together, which is such a privilege.
Matt, do we have time for one more?
Yes, and thank you. We have so many questions, it's hard to get to them all, but we just got a question about related to the federal government's role in state park protection of land and water. What are you anticipating will happen with the current administration in terms of being a partner in protecting, expanding state parks into the future?
Thanks. Well, I do know that the new Secretary of Interior, if she hasn't been approved yet, and she's Native American, which is pretty amazing. And really, as we've been looking at the appointments within the Department of Interior, which is really the primary partner for us, we have some astonishing alignments with that new leadership team in Washington. I was able to see the letter that our governor sent to President Biden relative to how he views California as being able to partner with the federal government in accomplishing the goals that this administration have. And I can tell you that the goals are astonishingly aligned. One of the things that we have to do right away is we just have to make sure that programs that have been put in place were not damaged by any of the actions of the previous administration. There was some threat recently to the Land and Water Conservation Fund, for example, and we're still trying to figure out how we're going to be able to continue to work with that. But I do think that I'm hoping that what we're doing in California will help inform our federal leadership on ideas on how we can move forward as a nation. I mean, this is the place where the first national park and the first state park were created in the nation and in the world. So it would be fun to learn and act together going forward. I'm hopeful.
And I'm hopeful too. And last, I think we are running out of time, but in our last minutes, I will say, we're going to invite you back for further conversation. B, I'm just so excited and inspired to hear you speak this way about the importance of these landscapes, of access for all, of really being forward-looking and thinking about the role that state parks can play. And I know that Semper Virens Fund, and I'm sure many of our partners are right there with you, ready to help you realize that vision. So thank you for really being so hopeful and optimistic and encouraging all of us to be thinking about these things in new ways.
And I am looking forward to visiting these places in person with all of you. I mean, I can hardly wait. So.
Well, thank you for joining us. And I want to thank all of our guests for joining us. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. And I want to encourage folks to return. We have a monthly series of these webinars with other really inspiring, interesting topics and guests. So please join us and please feel free to share this webinar with others by sending folks to our website. Next month's guest is Rob Biltman. He's a renowned nature photographer, and he's going to be talking about the art of nature and nature of his art. And he's a really engaging, compelling speaker will be talking about redwoods in a very different way than Director Quintero just did. But in any case, thank you again, Director Quintero, for joining us, for your leadership. We look forward to working with you.
Thank you so much for all of you do. Thanks so much. It's a privilege.
All right. Bye-bye, everybody.